birthday. I was obliged to declare myself as a conscientious objector and as a pacifist with a long tradition in my family, religious tradition of pacifism in my family. It was very, very difficult to articulate these arguments in writing, and I had I conferred with my minister at now St. John Cathedral in Knoxville, Tennessee, when I was confirmed, after I was confirmed and baptized there in April of 1972, and also with one of my teachers at the Lawrenceville School, Robert Wicks, who had gone to Union Seminary and studied with Reinhold Niebuhr. And I found great difficulty in making my arguments against living up to the Ten Commandments, thou shalt not kill, and my arguments against killing another man for political reasons in a war. And it was very, very difficult for me to get this position that I was taking in writing and make sense of it. And I didn't find either my Episcopal minister, William Lee, that helpful, nor my Lawrenceville teacher of philosophy and ethics, Robert Wicks. They were not necessarily sympathetic. I think that both of them would have wished to serve in the Second World War, especially to defeat the Nazi regime and its evil goal of exterminating all the Jews possible in Europe, the Holocaust. But finally I did get this down in writing, and it was presented to, I had to send it to my draft board in Knoxville, Tennessee. Fortunately, my father went down, all dressed up and looking handsome, and told them what a wonderful person I was, and charmed everybody at the draft board, and I got 1A status, which was a conscientious objector status. I would not have had to serve in the Vietnam War because I was in graduate school. I would have got a deferment on that basis.
So the whole thing was unnecessary?
The whole thing was ultimately unnecessary, but I was glad that I was able to establish my status as a CO, and to this day I'm very proud of that.
A CO?
It's called a conscientious objector.
All right, no need to do that. All right, so talk about...
My father had done alternate service because musicians were classed with window dressers and other people as not eligible to serve in the army or the armed forces, and he was actually too old to. When he tried to sign up and to go join the war effort, he was denied it because he was 38 years old. He was considered too old. But he did alternate service by farming my grandmother's farm near Marshall, Missouri, called the Redmond Farm. And he planted about 80 acres of corn for feed, not sweet corn, it was for feed. It's called maize here in Europe. And also about 30 acres of soybeans. He also raised Hereford cattle called whiteface, cattle. He had 28 of them, 28 a bull and called Ferdinand, and 28 heifers. And farming became a big farming. The Redmond, my grandmother's farm, became his whole occupation. He did write a lot of music during that time, and every day he'd practice 4 hours of the flute because he'd been second chair flute in the Chicago Symphony. After his mentor, and of whom he was a protege, Frederick Stock, died, he gave up his position as second flute in the Chicago Symphony Orchestra and became first flute in the Kansas City Symphony and assistant conductor. And he was later sent funded by Nelson Rockefeller, who was a kind of Latin American expert, who sent the American Woodwind Quintet to South America. They did 46 concerts, places like Trinidad, Argentina, all over every country. From Chile, Brazil, Rio, Sao Paulo, Buenos Aires, Trinidad, Mexico City. 46 concerts of the American Woodwind Quintet. And after that, because of their great success, and he also conducted a few concerts in Santiago de Chile, he was invited by the Chilean government to come back and sent by the State Department 4 times in 1944, 45, and later in 1960. He took a sabbatical from his job as professor of music and founder of the Music and Fine Arts Department at the University of Tennessee, and spent 3 months in Chile. He did 10 symphony concerts and gave 10 flute recitals with Federico Heinlein of Bach and other Baroque composers. It was greatly debilitating to him. He had a terrible dysentery and came back having aged about 10 years and lost a lot of weight. So that was his 4th tour to South America, sent by the American State Department. I did a report, which I submitted, U.S. State Department. I submitted a report on his trip to the State Department, which I wrote myself. And he also promoted a lot of American composers there, like Edward Cohn, professor at Princeton University, Walter Piston, and a lot of other American composers, Robert Sanders, Otto Luening, and others. Leo Sowerby, who we just studied with as a young man.
All right, what about World War I? Your grandfather?
My grandfather
He didn't fight?
Did not fight in World War I. He declared himself as a pacifist. He was against the war. The town came out and painted his factory, which made porch columns, which he had gotten a patent on, putting together slats and with a cable and screwing them up on the inside so they went. It made a round surface on the other side of the column, and he made this in his factory. And the town came out, painted his factory yellow, and he never got any business for porch columns anymore. Although he did build, he was a house builder, a very good carpenter, and had a very well equipped woodworking factory where he made the slats for the slats for the columns and other moldings and all sorts of things on a lathe. It was all driven by a gas motor and a band that ran through the whole factory and drove the lathe, the drills, saws, and it was one day from one of the machines, a nail flew up, put out his left eye. And he was in such agony that he prayed to God, and he made sort of a bargain with God that if he stopped the pain, if the Lord would stop the pain, he would become a Christian preacher, which he did. He had 7 churches. He was a circuit preacher. He'd type out sermons on single space on his typewriter and send them by mail to these 7 churches. And then he had his own church in August, Indiana.
Yes, but we're not doing the video about all that. Okay, we can do that.
All right, so I'll finish about the war.
His brothers.
His brothers
did fight.
Did fight, and they were gassed with mustard gas. They came back in horrible agony and tremendous pulmonary problems. And to relieve their agony, they got hooked on morphine, and he got them off. He got them. He was able to help his brothers with his Christian prayer. Through Christian prayer, he was able to get his brothers off their addiction to morphine. They were tall. I had a picture of all the brothers. They were over 6 feet, and their sister Em was also about 6 feet tall. Married to Harrison Brewer, the richest farmer in the whole area. So my maternal family, the Landers, were listed as chain bearers in the Revolutionary War. That was their only participation. Chains were needed to haul, to drag cannon through the woods and so on of North Carolina and Maryland and so on to fight the English.
In the Revolutionary War?
In the Revolutionary War.
What about this? You're skipping a whole war. What about the Civil War?
They did not participate in the Civil War.
I'm not talking about the Landers. Didn't you? What about?
Neither Van Vactors nor.
I'm not talking about Landers, Van Vactors, or I'm talking about our possible relation, our connection to Robert E. Lee.
Well, Robert E. Lee was a direct relative of the Lewis family. Sir Edward Lewis came to Albemarle County, Virginia in 1755, and he was given a grant by the King of England of 33 1/3,000 acres of land, of rich land in Albemarle County, Virginia, near Charlottesville, where they had their plantation house, which later became the Charlottesville Country Club.
Right, but so how are we related to the? How is
Robert E. The Lewises were directly related to Robert E. Lee, who was general of the.
Yes, we know.
Commanding general of the.
Everybody knows who he was, but of the Confederate Army, but
of the Confederate Army.
But David, how are we related to the Lewises?
Well, we're
through what family?
Through
the Landers?
No, through the Redmonds and Landers.
Both families? Yes,
they were. I mean, Mary Ellen Landers was. I mean, Lewis was the granddaughter was the daughter of Charles Lewis, who had a plantation in St. Louis, Missouri, and freed all his slaves in about 1865, before the Civil War.
No, the Civil War was over in 1865.
Well, I mean, he freed all their slaves in about 1860. So they became free men. And so none of the Lewises fought. Charles Lewis, my great-grandfather, James Thompson, Redmond, none of my great-grandfather and his father, James Tewksbury Redmond, who was born in Kentucky, none of them fought in the Civil War. In fact, my grandfather, James Thompson Redmond, was sent as heading up a mule train and on a covered wagon, and his aunt out to meet her husband. They were chaperoned. Their aunt, her husband was in Sacramento, California, in the gold rush, and they took 3 months to get out, leaving from St. Joe, Missouri, which was the gateway to the west. In 1862, and in that way he got out of being drafted into the Civil War. So it's basically his father's, by arranging this mule train journey with his brother Will, who was 14 at the time, and their aunt. His father arranged to get him out of this Civil War, so he avoided having to serve on the side of the Confederacy. So my family, neither side, Van Vactors, nor Lewises, nor Landers, served in their nation,
So
in any war.
So Robert E. Lee was not a direct. It's not a direct.
He was
ancestor.
He was an indirect. He was probably
by marriage.
Several times removed by marriage. Yeah.
Okay, so Revolutionary War? No?
No relations in that war either.
Alright, so before, no, what then, how many hundreds of years do we have to go back now?
Well, the Landers arrived in 1008. In fact, there's a tombstone of 1007 in Scotland someplace. They arrived in Berwick on the Tweed River in Scotland after the Norman invasion.
The Norman invasion wasn't until like 1061 or something.
Well, I know,
so
but
you're getting your dates all wrong.
But let me
saying 1007?
1007, there's a tombstone with
the Norman invasion doesn't happen until a whole generation later.
Oh, so that's all right. So it doesn't mean that they probably arrived before it and died in Scotland, and so that's why one of them is buried, and there's a tombstone there.
All right. I thought they came later.
No, they didn't come later, but they were there was a battle of Red Hall against the British, and one of the Landers was in that battle, along with other Scotsmen. I think that was 1068, actually.
The Battle of Red Hall?
Yes.
I can look on Google really quickly.
They were probably Flemish, from Flanders, from where Belgium is.
I think your dates are wrong. The First War of Scottish Independence was the initial chapter of engagements in a series of warring periods between English and Scottish forces lasting from the invasion of England in 1296 until the de jure restoration of Scottish independence with the Treaty of Edinburgh, Northampton in 1328, de facto independence This is Wikipedia.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if
It's a good thing.
this is way later than 1007, if not 1060 something. So your dates are all wrong, David.
Well, I mean, I got them from genealogies. I mean,
Then where do you get Red Hall?
I got it from a genealogy. That
Fine. Then why is Red Hall like a couple hundred years later?
Well, I mean, I don't know. I mean, look up the Battle of Red Hall.
I did.
What did it say? It said that they invaded England and that the independence was, Scottish independence was dated in something in Edinburgh at a certain later date, 13 or something, 1328 or something like that. Anyway, I mean, I've said enough. I mean, that's enough. You know, I've done it. That's my
Red Hall, but what about wasn't there another battle?
I have no knowledge of any other battle.
Hastings?
They weren't in the Battle of Hastings. Those were English troops that were defeated by William the Conqueror, Guillaume le Conqueror. They weren't in the Battle of Hastings.
Right.
No relative of mine or ancestor.
And before Red Hall?
You know,
Does it go?
all I know about the Landers ancestors is that they were probably cattle rustlers and came down from the highlands to steal people's cattle, and maybe their horses. You know, they were probably horse thieves. This is before they became soldiers, lawyers, preachers, or whatever. And there was two brothers who came over named Landers, and came to Philadelphia, arrived in Philadelphia, and they started a siege.
When they arrived in Philly?
Well, probably about late 18th century. In fact, they established a seed company called the Landers Seed Company in Philadelphia. It was very well known. Everybody knew that company, the high talker. Okay, that's all I've got to say. That's the extent of my knowledge. But I do have to, at a certain point, do an addendum to my father's biography about his turning back to the great invention of the 12-tone technique by Arnold Schoenberg.